Joan of Arc, the maid who saved France. Chapter 1. The silence before the storm. The wood is green. Too green. It will smoke before it burns properly, and the executioner knows this. He knows that suffering will be prolonged, that the girl chained to the stake above the pile will breathe smoke and agony before the true flames reach her. It is May 30th, 1431, and the old marketplace in Rouen has filled with thousands of spectators. English soldiers, French collaborators, merchants, peasants, clergy in their robes. They have come to witness justice, or revenge, or murder, depending on who you ask. The morning air carries the smell of rain from the night before, of wet stone and trampled earth. Wooden platforms have been erected to give the crowd a better view. The stake rises high, deliberately, obscenely high, so that even those in the back can see clearly what happens to those who claim to speak with God. Chained to that stake, in a long white robe, stands a girl of 19 years. Her hair has grown back since they cut it months ago, dark and uneven. Her face is pale but steady. They are going to burn Jeanne d'Arc. 15 months ago, she was the savior of France. She rode at the head of armies, her white banner streaming in the wind, her armor catching the sun. She broke the Siege of Orléans in 9 days, a siege that had strangled that city for 7 months. She led French forces to victory after victory, drove the English back from territories they had held for years, and stood beside Charles VII as he was crowned king at Rheims. She was La Pucelle, the maid, the virgin warrior sent by God to rescue France from destruction. Now she is chained to a stake in an English-controlled city, condemned as a heretic and a witch. This is how they deal with miracles they cannot explain. This is how they silence voices they cannot control. But before the flames rise, before her voice calls out the name of Jesus for the last time, before her story ends in smoke and ash, we must return to its beginning. We must go back to a time when France itself seemed to be ending, when hope had become a foreign word, when the darkness was so complete that only a light from heaven could pierce it. Or so the girl would claim. The 100 Years' War had been bleeding France for nearly a century by the time Joan was born. It began in 1337, when Edward III of England claimed the French throne, arguing that his lineage through his mother, daughter of a French king, gave him more right to rule than Philip VI. What followed was not one continuous war, but a series of brutal campaigns, truces, betrayals, and renewed violence that devastated the French countryside. English longbowmen cut down French knights at Crécy and Poitiers. Entire regions changed hands. Villages were burned. Crops were destroyed. Families fled. The social order collapsed into chaos. By 1415, Henry V of England invaded France with fresh armies and stunning ambition. At Agincourt, his forces destroyed a French army 3 times their size. The French nobility was slaughtered or captured. The French king, Charles VI, was known as Charles the Mad for his frequent bouts of insanity. The kingdom fractured into rival factions: the Armagnacs, loyal to the Dauphin Charles, and the Burgundians, who allied with the English out of revenge for old murders and shifting loyalties. France was not merely losing a war, it was tearing itself apart. By 1420, the Treaty of Troyes formalized France's humiliation. Henry V married Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, and the treaty declared that their future son would be king of both England and France. The Dauphin Charles was disinherited, labeled illegitimate, cast aside. When both Henry V and Charles VI died in 1422, the English proclaimed the infant Henry VI King of France. Charles VII, the Dauphin, the rightful heir, controlled only the regions south of the Loire River. He was uncrowned, impoverished, surrounded by doubting advisors. The English and their Burgundian allies held Paris, held the north, held Rheims, where French kings were traditionally crowned. Without that coronation, Charles's claim to the throne was weak, contested, almost laughable. France was dying. The peasants knew it best. They were the ones who watched English soldiers take their livestock, burn their homes, rape their daughters. They were the ones who starved when armies stripped the fields. They were the ones who paid taxes to whichever lord currently controlled their region, whether French, English, or Burgundian. The nobility might argue about bloodlines and treaties, but the common people understood a simpler truth. Their country was being destroyed, and no one was coming to save them. Into this darkness, into this hopelessness, into the killing cold of endless war, a girl would be born in an unremarkable village. She would grow up illiterate, working the fields, spinning wool. She would be nobody. She would have no power, no wealth, no education, no army, no authority, and she would save France. But that is later. First, there is only a child, and a garden, and a voice carried on summer wind that will change the course of history. First, there is Domrémy. Chapter 2. A child in the shadow of war. The village of Domrémy sat on the eastern frontier of French territory, in the Duchy of Bar, where the river Meuse curved through rolling farmland and thick forests. It was a small place, perhaps 50 households, where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noted before they reached the town limits. The church of Saint-Remy stood at the village centre, its bell marking the hours of prayer that governed peasant life. Fields of wheat and barley stretched beyond the homes. Cattle grazed in common pastures. It was the kind of place that should have been peaceful. But Domrémy was not peaceful. It was too close to Burgundian territory. It was loyal to the Dauphin Charles, in a region where loyalties shifted like river water. English and Burgundian forces raided the area regularly, taking what they wanted, burning what they could not carry. The war was not some distant abstraction for the people of Domrémy. It was the smoke on the horizon. It was the fear that accompanied every harvest. It was the possibility, every single day, that soldiers would come. Around January 1412, a girl was born to Jacques d'Arc and his wife Isabelle Romay. They named her Jeanne, Joan in English. Some sources suggest she was born on January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany, though Joan herself would later testify that she did not know the exact date of her birth. Peasants did not keep precise records. Survival mattered more than documentation. Jacques d'Arc was a tenant farmer, reasonably prosperous by peasant standards. He owned about 50 acres and held some authority in the village, collecting taxes and organizing the night watch. Isabelle Romay was known for her deep piety, her devotion to the church, her teachings about saints and prayer. The family was not wealthy, but neither were they destitute. They had enough. Joan was their fourth child. She had 3 older brothers, Jacquemin, Pierre, and Jean, and a sister, Catherine. It was an ordinary family in an extraordinary time. Joan's childhood was shaped by work and faith. She learned to spin wool and sew from her mother, skills she would later boast of during her trial. I fear no woman in Rouen at sewing and spinning. She helped in the fields when needed, tending the family's animals, though the image of Joan as a solitary shepherdess seems to be more legend than fact. Domrémy's main livestock was cattle, not sheep. The romantic vision of the lonely shepherd girl watching her flock is beautiful, but probably inaccurate. What is certain is that Joan worked hard and prayed harder. She attended church regularly, often going beyond what was required. Her childhood friends, who would later testify at her rehabilitation trial, remembered her as unusually pious. One friend, Menguette, recalled, "She was so good, simple and pious, that I and the other girls used to tell her that she was too pious." Joan would scold the church warden if he was late ringing the bells for prayer. While other children played and danced, Joan often slipped away to pray alone. She was kind and gentle in temperament, beloved by those who knew her, but there was something in her that was already set apart, an intensity, a seriousness. She loved the church and its stories of saints, particularly St. Catherine and St. Margaret, virgin martyrs who had died for their faith. Their statues stood in the church of Saint-Remy, and Joan would bring wildflowers to lay at their feet. The village had its traditions. There was an ancient oak tree called the fairy tree, where local legend said fairies once danced. Children would gather there on feast days to hang garlands and share cakes. Joan went with the other children, but the fairy stories did not interest her much. Later, during her trial, her enemies would try to use the fairy tree against her, suggesting she had learned witchcraft there. But this was desperation. The tree was simply part of village life, harmless folklore that Joan participated in the way all children did, without much thought. What truly marked Joan's early life was not fairies, but fear. Around 1419, when she was 7 years old, Domrémy was raided. Burgundian soldiers came and took the village's cattle. The farmers who depended on those animals for their livelihood watched helplessly as their futures were driven away. It was not the last time. In 1425, when Joan was 13, Burgundian forces under Lord Antoine de Vergy attacked again. This time, they burned homes and destroyed crops. The villagers, including Joan's family, fled to the nearby fortified town of Neufchâteau until the danger passed. These were the formative moments of Joan's childhood, not the peaceful spinning and sewing, but the sudden violence, the scramble to safety, the knowledge that nowhere was truly safe. She saw her village burn. She saw grown men made powerless. She saw her father's face as he realized his life's work could be destroyed by men in armor who served foreign lords. And she heard the adults whisper that this would never end, that France was lost, that English rule was inevitable. This was the world that shaped her, a world of war without victory, suffering without end, fear without relief. For most children, such a world would breed either resignation or bitterness. For Joan, somehow, it bred something else, something that would not accept defeat, something that would not bow. But she was still just a child, helping her mother, working the fields, attending church, living an unremarkable life in an unremarkable village. And then the voices came. Chapter 3. The Voice in the Garden. The day was warm. That is what Joan would remember later, when men in robes asked her to describe it again and again, searching for contradictions, for signs of demonic influence, for any reason to condemn her. The day was warm, and it was summertime, and she was standing in her father's garden. She was 13 years old. The church bells were ringing, calling the faithful to prayer, and Joan was alone among the vegetables her family grew for their table. The light came first, not the ordinary light of the sun, but something different, brilliant, overwhelming, pure. It appeared on her left side, toward the direction of the church, and within that light she saw a figure. Later she would identify him as Saint Michael the Archangel, though in that first moment she knew only terror. The figure was surrounded by other angels, shapes of impossible beauty that her peasant mind struggled to comprehend. The vision filled her senses. She could see it as clearly as she could see her own hands. It was not a dream. It was not imagination. It was there. Joan was frightened. She did not know what was happening to her. The girl who loved saints and prayer, who had knelt before their statues with flowers, was suddenly confronted with something beyond her understanding. She trembled. She may have cried out. And then the vision faded, leaving her standing alone in the garden. The ordinary summer day returned, the vegetables at her feet unchanged. She told no one. What could she say? Who would believe a peasant girl claiming to see angels? She carried the experience inside herself like a secret burn, wondering if she had imagined it, if she had fallen ill, if she was losing her mind the way King Charles VI had lost his. But the vision returned. Days later, then weeks later, it came again. Always with the brilliant light, always with the sense of presence, of being seen and known by something infinitely greater than herself. The figure told her to be good, to go to church regularly, to live a pious life. These were not shocking instructions. Any priest would have said the same. But the presence, the weight of divine attention, transformed these simple commands into something absolute. Joan understood. This was not merely advice. This was a test. God was watching her, preparing her, and she must not fail. As the months passed, the visions became more specific. Saint Michael told her that Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret would come to her, commissioned by God to guide and advise her. And they did. Joan began to see the two virgin martyrs, their faces crowned, their voices gentle and firm. They appeared to her regularly, sometimes once or twice a week. She conversed with them. She asked them questions. She said their voices were the most beautiful sounds she had ever heard. And when they left, she wept because she wanted to go with them. They smelled wonderful, she would later testify. She embraced them. They were as real to her as any living person. And slowly, their message changed. At first, they had told her simply to be good, to pray, to live righteously. But by the time Joan was 15 or 16, the instructions became urgent. France was in terrible danger. The English must be driven out. The Dauphin Charles must be crowned at Reims. And Joan, this illiterate peasant girl from an obscure village. Joan must be the one to accomplish these impossible tasks. The voices told her to go to Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander at Vaucouleurs, the nearest stronghold still loyal to the Dauphin. Baudricourt would give her an armed escort to the royal court at Chinon. She would meet the Dauphin. She would convince him to give her an army. She would break the Siege of Orléans. She would change the course of the war. She would save France. Joan's response was entirely reasonable. She told the voices she was a poor girl who knew nothing of warfare, who could neither ride a horse nor lead men into battle. She had no training, no authority, no resources. What they were asking was impossible. The voices insisted. Imagine being Joan in those years. Imagine hearing a command from heaven that defies all logic, all social order, all possibility. Women did not lead armies. Peasants did not advise kings. Illiterate farm girls did not change the fate of nations. Every rule of her world said this was madness. And yet the voices persisted, week after week, month after month, with the same impossible instruction. Go. You must go. France needs you. God has chosen you. Did she doubt? She must have. Did she fear she was losing her sanity? How could she not? But there was also something in Joan that recognized truth when it spoke, even when that truth was absurd. The visions had a clarity, a weight, a realness that dreams did not possess. When St. Michael and St. Catherine and St. Margaret appeared to her, they were not metaphors or symbols. They were presences. They spoke. They commanded. And deep in her soul, Joan believed them. She also understood that believing them would cost her everything. She would have to leave her family. She would have to violate every expectation for a young woman of her class and time. She would have to face mockery, rejection, danger, possibly death. The comfortable life she might have had, marriage, children, tending a farm, would be impossible. The voices were asking her to trade everything familiar for something terrifying and unprecedented. But the voices were also telling her that France was dying, that her king was in despair, that English forces were poised to destroy everything her people held dear. And if she did nothing, if she chose the safe path, the comfortable path, then she would know for the rest of her life that she had refused God's command. She would know she had let France fall when she might have saved it. This was the impossible choice placed before a teenage girl in a French village in the 1420s. Obey heaven and lose everything earthly, or obey earth and lose her soul. Joan made her choice. In May 1428, when she was about 16 years old, Joan asked her uncle, Durand-Lassois, to take her to Vaucouleurs. She told her family she was going to help her cousin with a childbirth. She did not tell them about the voices, about the mission, about the impossible thing she was about to attempt. Perhaps she knew they would stop her. Perhaps she knew they would think her mad. So she lied, and she left, and she went to meet Robert de Baudricourt. Chapter 4. The Maiden's Resolve. Robert de Baudricourt was a military man, practical and hardened by years of fighting in a losing war. He commanded the garrison at Vaucouleurs, one of the last strongholds in eastern France that still held loyal to the Dauphin Charles. He had seen much in his career: betrayals, defeats, the slow, grinding collapse of French power. He was not a man inclined toward mysticism or miracles. So when a peasant girl appeared before him in May 1428, claiming that voices from God had sent her to save France and crown the Dauphin, Baudricourt's response was predictable. He sent her home. He did not do so gently. He was harsh, dismissive. He told her uncle to take the girl back to her father and give her a good beating for her presumption. A peasant girl, illiterate, claiming to speak with saints. This was either delusion or deception, and Baudricourt had no time for either. He had a garrison to command, English forces to watch, and no patience for mystical nonsense. Joan returned to Domrémy, but she did not abandon her mission. The summer of 1428 brought fresh disasters to France. English reinforcements landed and prepared for new campaigns. In July, Burgundian forces attacked Domrémy again, burning homes and devastating the harvest. Joan and her family fled once more to Neufchâteau, sheltering behind stone walls while their village smoldered. When they returned, they found their church damaged, their homes scarred. The cycle of violence continued. Nothing changed, nothing improved. France kept bleeding. And the voices kept speaking to Joan. They grew more urgent. They told her that time was running short, that Orléans would soon be besieged, that she must reach the Dauphin before it was too late. St. Catherine and St. Margaret appeared to her with tears in their eyes, pleading with her to act. The weight of their command pressed down on her like a physical force. She knew she had to try again. In January 1429, Joan returned to Vaucouleurs. This time she had allies. She had won the support of two of Baudricourt's soldiers, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, who were moved by her conviction and her piety. Something about this girl was different. She spoke with an authority that should not have belonged to a peasant, with a certainty that was either divine or insane. The two soldiers believed it was divine. Baudricourt was harder to convince. He met with Joan again, still skeptical, still dismissive. But then something happened that shifted his perspective. Joan predicted a military defeat, a reversal at the Battle of Rouen near Orléans, where French forces were transporting supplies. She described the loss in specific detail. Days later, a messenger arrived with news confirming everything Joan had said. The battle had occurred exactly as she described, at a distance and time that made it impossible for her to have received natural knowledge of it. Baudricourt stared at the girl. How had she known? The distance was too great, the timeline too precise. If she had not been at the battle, and she clearly had not, then how had she seen it? Joan's answer was simple. Her voices had shown her. God had revealed it to her, so that Baudricourt would believe and would send her to the Dauphin. This was the sign she had promised. Baudricourt made his decision. He would allow Joan to travel to Chinon, the site of the Dauphin's court. He would provide an armed escort for the dangerous 11-day journey through territory controlled by English and Burgundian forces. He did not fully believe in Joan's divine mission, but he believed that something extraordinary was happening, and the Dauphin Charles needed all the help he could find. Before Joan left Vaucouleurs, the people of the town gave her what she needed for the journey. They provided her with men's clothing, a tunic, hose, boots, practical for long riding and safer for traveling through hostile lands. Joan cut her hair short in the style of a soldier. She was about 17 years old, slight of build, with a clear gaze and a voice that carried surprising force. Dressed as a man, she looked like a young soldier, which was precisely the point. A girl traveling alone would be in constant danger. A soldier, accompanied by other soldiers, might pass unnoticed. The escort consisted of 6 men, including Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy. They set out in early February, riding through winter cold and constant danger. They traveled mostly at night to avoid detection. They passed through enemy-controlled towns, always alert, always ready to flee or fight. Joan's companions later testified that they had continued to abandon her if she proved to be a madwoman or a fraud. But something about her made that impossible. When she spoke, they found themselves obeying. When she prayed, and she prayed constantly, they felt compelled to join her. She made them swear off the vices common to soldiers. No prostitutes, no gambling, no blasphemy. They must be pure, she told them, if they were to be instruments of God's will. Rough men, accustomed to the brutal life of medieval warfare, found themselves attending confession and avoiding curses because a teenage girl had commanded it. The journey took 11 days and covered nearly 240 miles. They forded rivers swollen with winter rain. They skirted towns where English banners flew. They rode through freezing darkness, trusting that God would shield them. And somehow, miraculously, they were not discovered. They encountered no enemy patrols. They reached Chinon safely. On the evening of March 6, 1429, Joan of Arc arrived at the royal fortress of Chinon, the temporary residence of Charles VII, the uncrowned Dauphin. She had traveled from obscurity to power, from her father's fields to the court of France. She had no armor, no title, no authority. She had only her voices and her unshakable conviction that God had sent her to save this dying kingdom. Now she would have to convince a desperate, doubting king that a peasant girl was his salvation. Chapter 5. The Dauphin's Test. Charles VII was 26 years old and had never known security. His father, Charles VI, had suffered from insanity, and during those madness-filled years, France had torn itself apart in civil war. His mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, had signed the Treaty of Troyes that disinherited him, declaring him illegitimate and unfit for the throne. Whether this was true or political expediency remained a source of rumor and shame. Charles had spent his youth watching his kingdom collapse, his armies defeated, his claim to the throne mocked by enemies and doubted even by some of his own supporters. He was thin, unattractive by the standards of his time, with a prominent nose and weak legs. He was not a warrior king like Henry V of England had been. He was cautious, often indecisive, surrounded by advisors who schemed against each other and counseled contradictory strategies. By 1429, he controlled only the territory south of the Loire River. Paris was lost. Rheims, where kings were crowned, was in enemy hands. His treasury was nearly empty. His armies were demoralized. Some at court openly questioned whether it was worth continuing the fight or whether they should simply submit to English rule and end the suffering. Into this atmosphere of defeatism and despair came a peasant girl, claiming to be sent by God. Charles did not grant Joan an immediate audience. She was kept waiting for days while the court debated what to do with her. Some advisors were curious. Others were skeptical or hostile. Was this some sort of trick by the English? Was she a spy, a madwoman, a witch? The Dauphin's counselor, Georges de la Trémoille, was particularly suspicious and tried to have Joan sent away without an audience. But word of her arrival had spread. The people in Chinon were talking about the girl from Lorraine who had come to save France. The soldiers who had escorted her testified to her piety and conviction. Pressure mounted for Charles to see her. Finally, on the evening of March 9, 1429, Joan was brought before the Dauphin. What happened next has become one of the most famous moments in her story, though the exact details are disputed. According to multiple accounts, Charles decided to test Joan. He knew that she claimed her voices had sent her specifically to him, that she would recognize him by divine guidance. So he arranged for one of his nobles to stand in the place of honor while Charles himself mingled among the crowd of courtiers, dressed simply, indistinguishable from the others. More than 300 people filled the great hall, lit by torches, filled with the whisper of anticipation. Joan entered. She had never seen Charles before, had no portrait to study, no physical description beyond vague generalities. But according to witnesses, she walked directly to him, pushing past the decoy, and fell to her knees before the unimpressive young man who was trying to hide among his courtiers. "God give you life, gentle king," she said. Charles, startled, tried to deflect. He pointed to the nobleman who had been standing in his place. "That is the king," he told her. Joan was not fooled. "In God's name, gentle prince, it is you who are the king, and no other." The court fell silent. How had she known? Charles had deliberately concealed himself. There were no identifying marks, no crown, no throne. And yet, this peasant girl had walked directly to him with absolute certainty. Charles granted her a private audience. What was said in that conversation, only the two of them ever knew. Joan later testified that she revealed to Charles a secret sign, something known only to him and God, something that convinced him of her divine mission. Speculation has raged for centuries about what this sign might have been. Some historians believe Joan reassured Charles about his legitimacy, confirming that he was indeed the rightful heir, despite his mother's betrayal. Others think she revealed military intelligence or made a prophecy that would soon be verified. Whatever she said, it worked. Charles was convinced, or at least he was convinced enough to take the risk. But he was also cautious. He did not immediately give Joan an army. Instead, he sent her to Poitiers, where she would be examined by theologians and church authorities for 3 weeks. These learned men would question her, probe her faith, search for signs of heresy or demonic influence. Joan would have to defend her visions and her mission before some of the most educated minds in France. The examination at Poitiers was thorough and skeptical. The theologians asked Joan about her voices, about the saints she claimed to see, about the specific instructions they had given her. They asked why God would choose an illiterate peasant girl instead of trained soldiers or nobles. They asked how she could be certain her visions came from God and not the devil, since demons were known to deceive. They questioned her right to wear men's clothing, which was forbidden by Scripture. They probed every aspect of her story, looking for contradictions or signs of madness. Joan answered with a directness that was either inspired or remarkably clever. When asked for a sign to prove her divine mission, she told them, "I did not come to Poitiers to give signs. Take me to Orléans, and I will show you the signs for which I was sent." When questioned about wearing men's clothing, she said it was more appropriate for her to dress as a soldier when traveling and living among soldiers than to wear a dress. When pressed about the legitimacy of her voices, she responded, "I know they come from God, and I say it more certainly than I know you are standing before me." She also displayed remarkable theological insight for someone with no formal education. When one examiner tried to trap her by asking whether she was in a state of grace, a question designed to be unanswerable, since claiming to know one's state of grace was considered presumptuous, while denying it would suggest sinfulness, Joan replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." The theologians were impressed. They could find no heresy in her words, no demonic signs in her behavior. She was devout, sincere, and remarkably composed under hostile questioning. They also noted the desperate state of France, and concluded that, given the circumstances, the Dauphin would be wise to accept Joan's help. What did they have to lose? If she failed, they were no worse off than before. If she succeeded, perhaps God truly had sent her. While at Poitiers, Joan was also examined by a group of matrons to verify her virginity. She submitted to this humiliating inspection because she knew it mattered. Her identity as La Pucelle, the maiden, the virgin, was central to her claim of purity and divine favor. The examination confirmed what she had said. She was indeed a virgin. This satisfied another requirement. The prophecies that had circulated in France spoke of a virgin from Lorraine who would save the kingdom. Joan fit the prophecy. On March 22nd, 1429, the theologians gave their verdict. Joan posed no threat, and might indeed be sent by God. They recommended that Charles accept her services. The Dauphin agreed. Chapter 6. The Siege of Orléans. Orléans was dying. For 7 months, since October 12, 1428, English forces had surrounded the city, strangling it slowly. The city sat on the north bank of the Loire River, a strategic gateway to the south of France and the heartland of Dauphin Charles's remaining territory. If Orléans fell, the English could march unimpeded into the heart of France and finish what they had started at Agincourt. Everyone understood the stakes. Orléans was not just another city. It was the last barrier standing between English ambition and complete conquest. The English siege was methodical and brutal. They had built a ring of fortified positions around the city. Bastilles, they were called. Earthwork forts and wooden towers that prevented supplies from entering and refugees from leaving. English and Burgundian forces totaled around 7,000 men, commanded by capable leaders, including the Earl of Suffolk and John Talbot. Inside the city, the French defenders numbered only about 2,500 soldiers, plus the civilian population. The disparity in forces meant that the French could not attack the English positions with any hope of success. All they could do was wait and hope for reinforcement. Month after month, no reinforcement came. Supplies dwindled. Morale collapsed. Some leading citizens fled the city, abandoning it to its fate. The people of Orléans began to believe they had been abandoned by their king, by God, by France itself. The English were patient. They did not need to storm the walls. Starvation would do their work for them. And then, on April 29th, 1429, Joan of Arc entered the city. She came at the head of a supply convoy, riding through an eastern gate that English forces had left weakly defended. She was wearing her white armor, holding her banner high, visible to everyone. Word of her coming had preceded her. Prophecies had circulated for years about an armed virgin who would come from the borders of Lorraine to save France. When the people of Orléans saw this girl in armor, carrying a banner with the name of Jesus, they erupted in joy and hope. Crowds pressed around her. They reached out to touch her horse, her armor, her banner. They wept, they prayed, they believed. Joan brought more than supplies. She brought belief that victory was possible. The French commanders were less enthusiastic. Men like Jean, the bastard of Orléans, the Duke of Orléans' illegitimate half-brother who commanded the city's defense, were professional soldiers who had fought in losing campaigns for years. They respected Joan's courage and the morale boost her presence provided, but they did not intend to let a 17-year-old peasant girl dictate military strategy. They told Joan that any assault on the English positions would have to wait for additional reinforcements. Joan was furious. Her voices had sent her to break this siege, and she had not come to wait. On the evening of May 4th, while resting in a house within the city, she suddenly sprang up, shouting that French blood was being spilled and she must go to battle. She hurried to arm herself. When she reached the streets, she discovered that French forces had indeed launched an assault on an English bastille to the east without informing her. The attack was in danger of failing. Joan rode toward the fighting, her banner streaming. When the French soldiers saw her coming, something changed. The fatigue and fear that had plagued them for months fell away. They rallied. They pressed the attack with renewed energy. The presence of the maid, La Pucelle, ignited something in them that had been dormant. They were not just fighting for territory or their lords. They were fighting for France, for God, for the girl who had promised them victory. The English fort fell. The next day was Ascension Thursday, a holy day, and Joan insisted the army rest and pray rather than fight. She spent the day in confession and prayer, and she demanded the soldiers do the same. She also sent another letter to the English commanders, repeating her warning: leave France or be destroyed. The English responded by calling her vile names and threatening to burn her as a witch when they captured her. Joan's response was to prepare for the assault she knew was coming. On the morning of May 6th, French forces moved to attack English fortifications on the south bank of the Loire. Joan crossed the river with the army. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Medieval warfare was not the organized, disciplined affair of later centuries. It was brutal, close-quarters violence. Swords cutting through flesh, arrows punching through armor, men screaming and dying in the mud. Joan rode through it, holding her banner high, shouting encouragement, directing troops, not through military expertise but through sheer force of will. By evening, the French had taken several bastilles. The English were withdrawing to stronger positions, but the most formidable English fort remained, Les Tourelles, a fortified gatehouse that controlled the main bridge into the city. Taking Les Tourelles would break the siege. Losing the assault would break French hope. On May 7th, the French army attacked Les Tourelles. The assault began early in the morning and raged all day. English defenders poured arrows and boiling oil down on the attackers. French soldiers scaled ladders, were thrown back, climbed again. Bodies piled up. The air filled with smoke and screaming. Joan was everywhere, urging the men forward, exposing herself to enemy fire with what seemed like reckless disregard for her own safety. And then, in the afternoon, an English crossbow bolt struck Joan in the neck, just above her shoulder. She fell. The pain was immediate and terrible. Blood soaked her armor. Her companions dragged her away from the fighting, certain she was dying. The French assault faltered. Soldiers looked toward where Joan had fallen and felt their courage drain away. It was over. The maid was struck down. God had abandoned them after all. But Joan did not die. The bolt had penetrated deeply, lodged between her collarbone and neck. It should have killed her, or at least incapacitated her for days. Instead, after her squire removed the bolt and dressed the wound with oil and lard, Joan rested for a short time, praying. And then she stood up. She put her armor back on, she took up her banner, and she returned to the battle. When the French soldiers saw her coming back, wounded but alive, holding her banner high, they erupted in fury and joy. They surged forward with a desperation born of divine inspiration. Joan climbed to a position where the enemy could see her clearly, and she shouted, "In God's name, we shall enter. Do not doubt." Her banner waved like a beacon. The French threw themselves at the fortifications with suicidal courage. The English line broke. Les Tourelles fell. English commanders who had held the position for months abandoned it and fled. The French poured across the bridge into the English-held south bank. By evening, the siege was effectively over. On May 8th, the remaining English forces withdrew, lifting the blockade that had held Orléans for 7 months. The city was free. Joan had been in Orléans for 9 days. In that time, she had transformed a dying city into a symbol of French resistance. She had led assaults that professional soldiers had deemed impossible. She had been wounded in battle and returned to fight. And she had delivered the first major French victory in decades. The people of Orléans called it a miracle. The English called it witchcraft. Military historians have debated for centuries what really happened. Was Joan a brilliant military strategist, an inspirational figurehead, or did divine intervention truly manifest on the battlefield? What is certain is this: before Joan arrived, French forces had been demoralized and defeated. After she arrived, they won. The Siege of Orléans was the turning point of the 100 Years' War. It was the moment when the English tide, which had seemed unstoppable, began to recede. And at the center of that moment stood a teenage girl in white armor, holding a banner that read, Jesus Maria. But Joan's mission was not complete. She had broken the siege, yes, but her voices had given her a second command, equally impossible. Crown the Dauphin at Reims, and between Orléans and Reims lay hostile territory, English armies, and a king who was not yet convinced that this peasant girl should dictate the course of the war. Joan of Arc had won her first impossible victory. Now she would have to win several more. Chapter 7. The Loire Campaign and the Crowning. The victory at Orléans sent shockwaves through France. A city that had been on the verge of surrender was now free. English forces that had seemed invincible had been routed, and the instrument of this reversal was a teenage girl who claimed to hear the voice of God. Soldiers who had been ready to desert now flocked to join the French army. Towns that had submitted to English rule began to reconsider their allegiances. Something had shifted. Hope, that rarest commodity in a century-long war, had returned. Joan did not rest. She knew the Siege of Orléans was only the first step. Her voices had given her a clear mission: break the siege, then take the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. Without that coronation in the traditional cathedral where French kings received the sacred oil of anointing, Charles's claim to the throne would always be questioned. The English could point to their own crowned king, the boy Henry VI, and argue that he was the legitimate ruler of France. Charles needed Reims, and Reims was deep in enemy territory. But first, Joan had to clear the English from the Loire Valley. Several English-held towns and fortifications stood between the French army and a clear path north. These had to be taken quickly, before the English could regroup and bring fresh forces to bear. On June 11th, the French army attacked Jargeau, a fortified town held by the Earl of Suffolk. Joan led the assault, carrying her banner and shouting encouragement as French soldiers stormed the walls. She climbed a scaling ladder during the attack and was struck on the head by a stone thrown from the ramparts. The blow knocked her from the ladder. Her companions again feared she was dead. Again, she got up, apparently unharmed, and pressed forward. The town fell. The Earl of Suffolk was captured. 2 days later, on June 15th, the French captured the bridge at Meung-sur-Loire, cutting English supply lines. On June 17th, they took Beaugency, after the English garrison negotiated surrender rather than face an assault. The speed and decisiveness of these victories was unprecedented. French forces that had been hesitant and defensive were now attacking with confidence. The difference was Joan. Her presence made soldiers believe they could not lose. But the most significant battle was yet to come. On June 18th, 1429, at Patay, the French encountered an English army led by John Fastolfe and John Talbot, two of England's most experienced commanders. The English forces were retreating north, trying to consolidate their position, when French cavalry scouts stumbled upon them. The circumstances were almost accidental. A deer, startled by the French approach, bolted into the English archers, who shouted and scrambled, revealing their position. La Hire and the other French commanders seized the opportunity. They attacked immediately, not giving the English time to form their defensive positions. The Battle of Patay was a slaughter. English longbowmen, who had decimated French knights at Agincourt and Crécy, never got the chance to deploy properly. French cavalry smashed into them before they could set their stakes and form their lines. The English army broke. John Talbot was captured. John Fastolfe fled. French casualties were minimal. English casualties numbered in the thousands. Patay was the inverse of Agincourt. It was France's revenge for decades of humiliation, and it opened the road to Reims. Joan immediately urged Charles to begin the march to Reims, but the king and his advisors hesitated. Reims was more than 100 miles away, through territory controlled by the Burgundians, England's allies. The journey would be dangerous. Charles was cautious by nature, and his councillors were deeply skeptical that this sudden run of victories could continue. They counselled delay, consolidation, negotiation. Better to secure what they had won than risk everything on a dangerous march. Joan would not accept delay. She told Charles that her voices were insistent. He must go to Reims now, while the momentum was with them, while the English were in disarray. If they waited, the opportunity would be lost. Charles, against the advice of his councillors, agreed. On June 29th, the French army set out from Gien, marching north toward Reims. It was an act of extraordinary courage or extraordinary faith, depending on your perspective. They were marching through hostile territory, with no guarantee that towns along the way would open their gates or that Burgundian forces would not intercept them. Joan rode at the head of the column, her white banner visible, her presence galvanizing. Charles followed with his nobles and advisors, who were probably praying this would not be the end of the Valois dynasty. The first test came at Auxerre, which refused to open its gates. Joan wanted to attack, but Charles's advisors negotiated a truce instead. The army moved on. At Saint-Florentin, the town yielded. At Troyes, which had signed the Treaty of Troyes that disinherited Charles, the city initially resisted. Joan called for an assault. Her determination and the army's confidence convinced the city leaders to surrender rather than fight. Chalon-sur-Marne also submitted. On July 16, 1429, the French army entered Reims. The city had been in Burgundian hands, but faced with a victorious French army and the presence of the Maid who had broken Orléans, they chose to switch sides rather than face a siege. The Cathedral of Reims, the traditional site of French royal coronations, was opened. On July 17th, Charles VII was crowned and anointed King of France. The ceremony was magnificent. The cathedral was filled with nobles, clergy, soldiers, and common people who had come to witness the event. The sacred oil, kept in the holy ampulla and used for every French king since the time of Clovis, was brought out and used to anoint Charles. The ritual transformed him from dauphin, an heir in waiting, to king in full authority. The theological and political significance was immense. Charles now had the same legitimacy as any other consecrated king of France. The English claim that Henry VI was the rightful ruler became much harder to sustain. And standing beside the king, in her white armor, holding her banner, was Joan. She had been given a place of honor at the ceremony, a recognition of her role in making this coronation possible. When asked later why her banner was present at the coronation, Joan replied, "It had borne the burden, so it deserved the honor." For Joan, this was the completion of her mission. Her voices had told her to break the Siege of Orléans and bring the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. She had done both. The impossible had been accomplished. She asked Charles for permission to return home, to her family, to the quiet life she had left behind. She had done what God asked of her. Surely she could rest now. Charles refused. He wanted her to stay with the army. There were more campaigns to fight, more English forces to drive out. Joan had become a symbol too valuable to let go, and so she remained. Even though her voices had begun to tell her something new and terrible. She would be captured before St. John's Day, June 24th of the following year. She would not die in battle. She would be taken prisoner. Joan knew what was coming, and she stayed anyway. Chapter 8. The Tide Turns. After the coronation at Reims, the momentum that had carried the French army from victory to victory began to slow. Charles VII and his advisors wanted to consolidate their gains, to negotiate where possible rather than fight. Joan wanted to press the advantage, to drive the English completely from French soil while they were still reeling. The difference in strategy would prove fatal. In late August and early September 1429, Joan urged an assault on Paris. The city was the symbolic and administrative heart of France, and it was held by English and Burgundian forces. Taking Paris would be an enormous blow to English prestige and would secure Charles's position as the unchallenged King of France. Charles agreed to the attack, though with little enthusiasm. The assault on Paris on September 8th was a disaster. The city's defenses were formidable, and the defenders were ready. Joan led the attack as she had at Orléans, carrying her banner, urging the soldiers forward. But this time, the magic did not work. French forces could not breach the walls. Joan was wounded again, this time by a crossbow bolt that struck her thigh. As she lay bleeding, she refused to retreat, shouting that the assault must continue, that Paris would fall if they just kept fighting. But it would not fall. Charles called off the attack. Joan was carried away, protesting that victory had been within reach if only they had continued, but the momentum was broken. Paris remained in English hands, and the confidence that Joan's presence had inspired began to crack. Charles then negotiated a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good. The truce was meant to be a pause in fighting, a chance for diplomacy. In practice, it committed Charles to near inaction while the English and Burgundians regrouped. Joan opposed the truce vehemently. She understood that truces with enemies who had no intention of honoring them simply gave those enemies time to prepare. But Charles's advisors, many of whom resented Joan's influence and were eager to marginalize her, supported the truce. From September 1429 to April 1430, Joan was effectively sidelined. The royal court kept her close but inactive. She was honored, celebrated, granted a coat of arms, 3 golden fleurs-de-lis on a blue field, along with a sword supporting a crown, but she was not given armies to command or campaigns to fight. It must have been maddening for someone who had accomplished so much in such a short time to be kept idle while France's enemies recovered their strength. Her voices during this period became more urgent and more ominous. St. Catherine and St. Margaret appeared to her with tears, warning her that she would be captured soon, that her time of freedom was running out. They told her to accept her fate, that it was God's will, that suffering lay ahead. Joan prayed for strength. She did not pray to be spared. In April 1430, Joan finally received permission to take action. She gathered a small force, her brothers, her confessor Jean Pasquerel, her squire Jean d'Aulon, and a mercenary company of about 200 men, and headed for the town of Compiègne. The town was under siege by Burgundian forces, and Joan intended to relieve it. It was now late May, approaching the feast of St. John on June 24th, the date her voices had prophesied for her capture. Joan knew the danger. She continued anyway. Some who were with her later testified that she seemed resigned, almost serene, as if she had already accepted what was coming. On May 23, 1430, Joan led a small sortie out of Compiègne against Burgundian positions. It was not a major battle, just a skirmish, the kind of minor engagement that happened constantly in medieval warfare. But as the French forces began to retreat back toward the city gates, Burgundian reinforcements arrived. The retreat became a rout. Soldiers fled toward the safety of Compiègne's walls. Joan stayed behind to cover the retreat. She fought on horseback, her standard held high, trying to hold off the pursuing Burgundians so that her men could reach safety. It was the kind of selfless courage she had shown throughout her campaigns. But this time, there would be no miraculous escape. An archer grabbed her horse's reins. Soldiers surrounded her. She was pulled from her saddle and captured. The city gates of Compiègne closed, shutting out the enemy and sealing Joan's fate outside the walls. The men she had been protecting were safe. She was not. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, the girl who had saved France, was now a prisoner. The Burgundians who captured her knew exactly what they had. She was worth a fortune in ransom. More importantly, she was a symbol of French resurgence, and her capture would demoralize the French as much as her presence had inspired them. Within days, negotiations began to sell her to the English. The price was 10,000 francs, equivalent to the ransom of a prince. Charles VII, the king Joan had crowned, the man who owed his throne to her courage and faith, made no effort to ransom her. He negotiated no prisoner exchanges. He sent no rescue parties. Whether this was because he lacked the funds, because his advisors convinced him it was politically unwise, or because he was simply willing to abandon her now that she had served her purpose, remains a matter of historical debate. But the result was clear. Joan was alone. She tried to escape. While held at Beaurevoir Castle, She jumped from a tower window, falling 70 feet to the ground. She survived, battered but alive, and was recaptured. Later, during her trial, this desperate leap would be used against her, labeled as an attempted suicide and therefore a sin. But Joan explained that she had been trying to escape to help the French people, and she knew the English intended to burn her. It was not suicide, it was a desperate attempt at freedom. By January 1431, Joan was in English hands, transferred to Rouen, the military and administrative capital of English-occupied France. There she was imprisoned in a tower of the castle, chained to a wooden block at night, guarded constantly by English soldiers who made no secret of their contempt and hostility. And there, in that cold stone cell, the English prepared to put her on trial. They could not simply execute her. That would create a martyr and validate her claim to be sent by God. Instead, they needed to destroy her credibility, to prove she was a heretic and a witch, to show that any victory she had inspired was the work of demons rather than divine favor. If they could do that, then Charles VII's coronation would be tainted by association with heresy, and the English claim to the French throne would be strengthened. The trial would be a show trial, the outcome predetermined, but it would also become one of the most extensively documented events in medieval history, creating a record that would preserve Joan's words long after her enemies had turned to dust. Chapter 9. The Trial. The trial of Joan of Arc began on January 9, 1431, in Rouen. It was conducted by an ecclesiastical court, a church court, ostensibly concerned with matters of faith and heresy rather than secular crimes. But make no mistake, this was a political trial dressed in religious garb. The English wanted Joan condemned, and they had found a churchman willing to do their work, Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon was ambitious, ruthless, and loyal to the English cause. He had been driven from his own diocese by French forces and had allied himself with the English occupiers. He understood that condemning Joan would earn him favor with the English crown and might restore his lost bishopric. He also understood that the trial needed the appearance of legitimacy. He assembled a panel of assessors, theologians, lawyers, clergymen, to participate in the proceedings and lend them credibility. Not all of these men supported the English. Some were genuinely trying to examine whether Joan was a heretic, but Cauchon controlled the process, and the outcome was never in doubt. The individual charges against Joan numbered 70, a sprawling list that included everything from heresy to wearing men's clothing to theft of a horse. As the trial progressed, these charges were whittled down to 12 that the prosecutors believed they could sustain. The core accusations were clear. Joan claimed to receive direct revelations from God, bypassing the church's authority. She wore men's clothing in defiance of biblical prohibitions. She refused to submit her actions and beliefs to the judgment of the church. She was, therefore, a heretic. Joan defended herself without a lawyer, something that was highly unusual and put her at a severe disadvantage. She was 19 years old, illiterate, untrained in theology or law, facing a panel of educated men determined to trap her into statements that could be used to condemn her. She should have been helpless. She was not. Joan's responses during the trial were remarkable. When asked to swear an oath to answer all questions truthfully, she agreed, but added that she would not reveal everything, particularly matters concerning her king that were confidential. When pressed about her voices and whether she was in a state of grace, she gave the famous reply, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a theologically sophisticated answer that avoided the trap while affirming her faith. The interrogations were relentless. Day after day, Joan was brought before the court and questioned about her visions, her voices, her military campaigns, her clothing. The assessors tried repeatedly to get her to contradict herself or to claim knowledge she could not possibly have. They asked about the appearances of the saints she claimed to see. What did they look like? What did they wear? Did they have hair? Joan grew frustrated with these questions, snapping that she had not gone to measure them. The issue of her male clothing became a particular focus. Joan explained that she wore men's clothes for practical reasons. When traveling with soldiers, when sleeping among men, when riding into battle, it was safer and more appropriate to dress as a soldier than as a woman. She also testified that her voices had instructed her to wear this clothing. But the prosecutors insisted that by wearing men's clothes, Joan was violating Deuteronomy 22:5, which forbids men from wearing women's clothing and vice versa. Therefore, she was defying scripture and the natural order ordained by God. Joan was imprisoned in degrading conditions. She was chained, guarded by hostile English soldiers who likely assaulted and threatened her. She requested multiple times to be transferred to a church prison where she could be guarded by women, as was appropriate for female prisoners. This request was denied. She was kept in a secular military prison, vulnerable and isolated, precisely to break her will. The trial also explored Joan's refusal to submit to the church. When asked whether she would accept the judgment of the church militant, the institutional church on earth, regarding her visions and actions, Joan insisted that she would submit only to the church triumphant, the church in heaven, meaning God and the saints. This was heretical. The medieval church taught that the institutional church was the sole interpreter of God's will, and claiming direct communication with heaven that bypassed church authority was grounds for condemnation. Joan tried to explain that she was not rejecting the church. She attended Mass, she took communion, she confessed her sins, she loved the church. But she could not deny what her voices had told her, and her voices came from God. If the church told her that her voices were false, she would be stuck in an impossible position. Obey God or obey the church. Joan chose God. By late May, the court had what it needed. Joan had consistently claimed direct revelation from heaven and had refused to submit those claims to church authority. She was declared a heretic. The sentence for unrepentant heresy was death by burning. On May 24th, Joan was brought to a cemetery, where scaffolds had been erected for a public ceremony. There she was confronted with her choices: recant her claims, admit that her voices were false, submit fully to the church, and she would be sentenced to life imprisonment. Refuse, and she would be burned. Joan signed an abjuration. The exact content of what she signed is disputed. She was illiterate and had to make her mark rather than sign her name, and some witnesses later testified that the document read to her was different from the one she marked. But she agreed to some form of recantation. She was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. Her male clothing was taken away. She was given a dress. But Joan was not placed in a church prison as promised. She was returned to the same English military prison, guarded by the same hostile men. What happened in the days that followed is not fully documented, but the implications are clear. Joan's guards likely threatened or assaulted her. They may have attempted rape. Joan, terrified and desperate, put her male clothing back on, either because it was all that was available or because she understood that wearing male clothing made her less vulnerable. When Cauchon and his assessors visited her cell on May 28th, they found her wearing men's clothes again. They asked why. Joan, according to the trial record, said that it was more appropriate and safer to wear men's clothes when imprisoned with men, and that the judges had broken their promise to move her to a proper prison. She also said that her voices had returned, reproaching her for her abjuration, telling her she had sinned by recanting. This was exactly what Cauchon needed. Joan had relapsed. She had returned to heresy after abjuring it. Under church law, a relapsed heretic could not be given a second chance. The sentence was death. On May 29th, Joan was declared a relapsed heretic and handed over to the secular authorities for execution. Technically, the church did not execute people. It condemned them and then released them to civil authorities who carried out the sentence. But this was a legal fiction. Everyone knew what released to the secular arm meant. Joan spent her last night in prayer. She was allowed, extraordinarily, to receive communion and make confession despite being a condemned heretic. Perhaps even Cauchon felt some twinge of conscience, or perhaps he wanted to deny Joan nothing on her final night. She knew what was coming. The soldiers guarding her later testified that she wept but did not despair. She prayed. She asked her confessor to hold a cross high during her execution so she could see it above the flames. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the old marketplace in Rouen to be burned at death. Chapter 10. The Flames of Rouen. The morning was grey. Rain had fallen during the night, leaving the stones slick and the air heavy. The marketplace in Rouen had been prepared with grim efficiency. A tall scaffold erected, a stake rising high above the gathered crowd, wood piled below. The wood was green, still damp. It would smoke more than burn, prolonging the agony. Whether this was intentional or simply the result of available materials, it would make Joan's death slower and more painful. The crowd numbered in the thousands. English soldiers came to see the witch burned. French collaborators came to witness justice, or what they told themselves was justice. Common people came out of morbid curiosity or genuine grief. Clergy filled special sections, including many of the assessors who had participated in Joan's trial. Some looked satisfied. Others looked troubled. A few looked ashamed. Joan was brought from her prison cell to an abbey in the city centre. There she was given her sentence one final time. She was a relapsed heretic, and therefore she would be handed to the secular authorities to be burned. She was told to prepare her soul. Joan asked to attend Mass one last time. This request was granted. She received communion with tears streaming down her face, praying intensely. Then she was placed in a cart and driven to the marketplace. She wore a long white robe, the kind reserved for condemned heretics. A pointed cap was placed on her head, inscribed with the words, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater." The cart moved slowly through the streets, giving the crowds time to see her, to jeer or to weep, depending on their sympathies. Joan prayed continuously. Her lips moved in constant prayer, calling on Jesus, calling on the saints who had guided her, seeking strength for what was coming. When the cart reached the marketplace, Joan was led to the scaffold. The stake rose before her, impossibly high. Cauchon was there. So was John de Warwick, the English commander of Rouen. So were hundreds of English soldiers, eager to see this girl who had humiliated them at Orléans finally destroyed. Joan was forced to endure one final sermon, a public denunciation of her crimes and heresies, delivered by a priest who seemed to take pleasure in his task. And then it was time. Joan asked for a cross. She wanted to die looking at the crucifix, focusing on Christ's suffering rather than her own. An English soldier, moved by pity, or perhaps just human decency, took 2 pieces of wood and tied them together in the shape of a cross. He gave it to Joan. She kissed it and placed it against her chest. She asked for a processional crucifix from the church as well, something larger that she could see from a distance once the flames began. A priest fetched one from the church of Saint-Sauveur. Joan embraced it, kissing it repeatedly, and then her hands were bound behind her back. The executioner led her to the stake. She was chained to it, her feet barely touching the ground, positioned high above the crowd so that everyone could witness clearly. The wood was lit. At first, there was more smoke than flame. Joan coughed, choking on the thick grey smoke that rose from the green wood. The heat built slowly. And then the flames caught, orange and terrible, climbing toward her. Joan did not scream. She prayed. Her voice rose above the crackle of fire, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "Jesus!" she called. "Jesus! Jesus!" She repeated the name of Christ again and again, her voice strong at first, then cracking as the smoke filled her lungs. The flames reached her feet, her legs, began to consume her robe. Still, she called out, "Jesus! Jesus!" The priest holding the crucifix stood as close as he dared, holding it high so Joan could see it through the smoke and flames. Joan's eyes fixed on it. Even as the fire took her, she kept her gaze on the cross, kept calling the name of Jesus. Her voice grew weaker, choked by smoke, but she did not stop praying. Witnesses later testified to different details of those final moments. Some said they saw her lips still moving in prayer, even after her voice failed. Some said they saw a dove rise from the flames, though whether this was a real bird startled by the fire or a symbol their grief-stricken minds created is unknowable. Some said they heard her cry out, "Jesus!" one final time as the flames consumed her. Others said they saw her head bow forward, and then she was gone. The executioner was a man named Geoffroy Terrage. He would later testify that he had burned many heretics and criminals in his career, but Joan's execution haunted him. He said he had never seen anyone die with such faith, such courage, such utter conviction that she was going to God. He wept after her death, convinced that he had just burned a saint. Once Joan was dead, Cauchon ordered the executioner to rake apart the pyre so that the crowd could see her charred body, proving that she was truly dead and not spirited away by demons, as some might claim. The remains were then burned a second time to reduce them completely to ash. Finally, those ashes were thrown into the Seine River so that no relics could be collected, no shrine erected, no physical trace of Joan of Arc preserved. The English had gotten their wish. The girl who had terrified them, who had broken their siege and crowned their enemy, was dead. She could inspire no more victories. She could threaten no more English positions. She was ash and gone. But the English had made a critical miscalculation. By burning Joan as a heretic, they did not destroy her legend. They created it. They transformed a peasant girl into a martyr, and martyrs are far more dangerous than soldiers. The people of France would remember this execution. They would remember a 19-year-old girl who saved their nation and was rewarded with chains and flames. They would remember that their enemies had to burn her because they could not defeat her. They would remember her courage, her faith, her refusal to deny the voices that came from God. And that memory would sustain French resistance for decades, until, finally, the English were driven from French soil entirely. Joan of Arc died on May 30th, 1431, but her story was far from over. Chapter 11. Redemption and Sainthood. For 20 years after Joan's execution, France continued its long struggle against English occupation. The war ground on, battles won and lost, territories changing hands, treaties signed and broken. But slowly, steadily, the balance shifted in France's favor. The inspiration Joan had provided, the belief that French victory was possible, could not be burned away. By 1435, 4 years after her death, the Duke of Burgundy broke his alliance with England and reconciled with Charles VII. This shifted the strategic situation dramatically. By 1453, the 100 Years' War was over. France had won. Only Calais remained in English hands, and even that would eventually be retaken. Charles VII, who had done nothing to save Joan when she was captured, waited until victory was assured before addressing the injustice of her trial and execution. In 1449, 19 years after her death, he commissioned an inquiry into the circumstances of her capture and trial. This was partly political. If Joan's condemnation as a heretic stood, then it could be argued that Charles's coronation was performed by a heretic and was therefore invalid. But it may also have been conscience. Charles had owed his throne to Joan, and he had abandoned her. The inquiry gathered testimony from those who had known Joan, her childhood friends from Domrémy, soldiers who had fought beside her, members of Charles's court who had witnessed her at Chinon and Orléans. These witnesses uniformly testified to her piety, her courage, her sincere faith. They described a girl who attended church constantly, who wept when her voices left her, who insisted that her soldiers confess their sins and live moral lives. They spoke of her military achievements, her presence on the battlefield, her willingness to expose herself to danger to inspire her troops. This preliminary inquiry established that Joan had been neither a heretic nor a witch, but it did not have the authority to overturn the verdict of the original trial. For that, a formal appeal to the church was necessary. In 1452, Cardinal Guillaume d'Estouteville, a papal legate, conducted a more thorough investigation. He examined the records of the 1431 trial and interviewed additional witnesses. What emerged was a clear picture of judicial corruption and procedural violations. Cauchon had denied Joan access to legal counsel. He had refused to move her to an ecclesiastical prison. He had allowed English soldiers to guard and likely abuse her. He had ignored testimony favorable to Joan and emphasized anything that could be used against her. The trial had been a sham from the beginning. But even this investigation was not sufficient to overturn a church court's verdict. Finally, in 1455, Joan's mother, Isabelle Romée, and her brothers petitioned Pope Calixtus III directly, asking for a formal rehabilitation trial. The Pope agreed. A new tribunal was established, headed by Jean Bréhal, the Inquisitor General of France. The rehabilitation trial began on November 7, 1455, at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Over the next 8 months, The tribunal heard testimony from 115 witnesses. They examined the trial records from 1431 in exhaustive detail. They consulted with theologians and legal experts. They investigated every aspect of Joan's life, her capture, her trial, and her execution. The witnesses who testified painted a consistent picture of Joan as a devout, sincere young woman who genuinely believed she was acting on divine instruction. Her childhood friends described her exceptional piety. Her soldiers described her courage and her insistence on moral conduct. The clergy who had examined her at Poitiers testified that they found no heresy in her words. Even some of the assessors from the original trial admitted, 25 years later, that they had been pressured by Cauchon and the English, that they had doubted the verdict, even as they participated in delivering it. The tribunal also found extensive evidence of procedural violations and judicial misconduct in the original trial. Cauchon had manipulated the process from the beginning. He had cherry-picked assessors sympathetic to the English cause. He had denied Joan basic rights afforded to accused heretics. He had allowed, possibly encouraged, the abuse she suffered in prison. The trial had been designed to produce a guilty verdict, regardless of the evidence. On July 7, 1456, the Rehabilitation Tribunal issued its judgment. The verdict of the 1431 trial was declared null and void. The sentence was revoked. Joan of Arc was officially declared innocent of all charges of heresy. The tribunal went further, stating that Cauchon and his co-conspirators had acted through cowardice, fraud, calumny, iniquity, and malice, contrary to the holiness of the Church and to the salvation of souls. As a symbolic gesture, the tribunal ordered that a copy of the original articles of accusation be publicly torn apart. They also ordered that a cross be erected at the site in Rouen where Joan had been executed, proclaiming her innocence and honoring her memory. Joan's family was present at the reading of the verdict. Isabelle Romay, now elderly, wept. She had fought for a quarter-century to clear her daughter's name. Pierre and Jean, Joan's brothers, who had fought beside her, were vindicated. The girl they had known as pious and courageous was officially recognized as such. But formal exoneration was not the same as sainthood. The Church recognized that Joan had been wrongly convicted, but that did not automatically make her a saint. For that, a separate process of canonization would be required, and it would take far longer. For centuries, Joan remained a folk hero in France, but not an official saint. Her story was told and retold, growing in legend and romanticism. Artists painted her. Writers composed poems and plays about her. She became a symbol of French nationalism, especially during later conflicts. Napoleon promoted her memory. Later French governments, both royalist and republican, claimed her as a symbol of French identity and resistance to foreign oppression. The formal process towards sainthood began in 1869, when the Bishop of Orléans petitioned the Church to consider Joan for beatification, the first step toward canonization. The process moved with characteristic slowness. The Church investigated Joan's life again, examined the rehabilitation trial records, consulted with theologians about the nature of her visions. On January 6, 1904, Pope Pius X declared Joan venerable, acknowledging that she had lived a life of heroic virtue. This was the first step in the canonization process. On April 18, 1909, Joan was beatified by Pope Pius X in a ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Beatification is the second step towards sainthood, declaring that a person is in heaven and capable of intercession. Joan was now blessed Joan of Arc. Finally, on May 16, 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, Pope Benedict XV canonized Joan of Arc as a saint of the Catholic Church. The ceremony took place at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome before a crowd of thousands. Joan was declared Saint Joan of Arc, with her feast day set on May 30th, the anniversary of her death. The girl who had been burned as a heretic was now officially recognized as one of God's greatest servants. France declared her one of its patron saints. Statues of her were erected throughout the country. Churches were dedicated to her. The house where she was born in Domrémy became a pilgrimage site. Every year on May 30th, France honors her memory. Every year, the story of the peasant girl who saved a nation is told again. St. Joan of Arc stands as proof that God uses the unlikely, the overlooked, the powerless. She was illiterate. She was female. She was poor. She had no army, no title, no authority. She had only faith and courage. And with those, she changed the world. Chapter 12. The Legacy. The 100 Years' War ended in 1453. France had won. English forces withdrew from nearly all French territory, retaining only Calais, which they would eventually lose as well. The France that emerged from that long conflict was transformed, more unified, more conscious of itself as a nation rather than a collection of feudal territories. And at the heart of that transformation was the memory of a girl who had believed in France when France had stopped believing in itself. Military historians still debate Joan's tactical brilliance. She had no training in warfare, no education in military strategy, yet the campaigns she influenced were marked by aggressive, decisive action that contrasted sharply with the cautious, defensive approach that had characterized French efforts for decades. Was she a brilliant strategist? Or did her presence simply inspire professional commanders to take risks they had previously avoided? Perhaps both. Perhaps the distinction does not matter. What matters is that before Joan, the French were losing. After Joan, they won. The question of her visions remains unanswerable. Were they truly communications from heaven? Were they hallucinations caused by some neurological condition? Were they the manifestation of a brilliant, intuitive mind expressing itself in the religious language Joan knew? Modern doctors have speculated about epilepsy, schizophrenia, various forms of temporal lobe conditions that can cause auditory hallucinations. Medieval theologians debated whether the visions came from God or demons. The Rehabilitation Tribunal declared them divine. The Condemnation Tribunal declared them demonic. But Joan believed them. That belief was real. That faith was genuine. And that faith moved her to action that changed history. Whether the voices were objectively real or products of her own mind almost does not matter in the face of what she accomplished by believing in them. Joan's legacy extends far beyond military history. She became a symbol that different groups claim for different purposes. To monarchists, she represented loyalty to the rightful king. To Republicans, she represented the common people rising against oppression. To feminists, she represented a woman who challenged gender norms and exercised authority in a male-dominated world. To Catholics, she represented faith and martyrdom. To nationalists, she represented French pride and resistance to foreign domination. All of these interpretations contain some truth, but all also risk reducing Joan to a symbol rather than recognizing her as a person. She was not trying to make a statement about gender roles. She wore men's clothing because it was practical, and she commanded armies because her voices told her to, not because she was trying to challenge patriarchy. She was not trying to create a nationalist movement. She fought for France because that was the mission God had given her, as she understood it. Her motivations were religious, not political. But the fact that her actions resonated politically, that they inspired generations long after her death, speaks to something deeper. Joan demonstrated that extraordinary courage and faith can achieve what seems impossible. She proved that social barriers, gender, class, education, need not be final. She showed that one person, believing deeply enough in something, can move entire nations. Her story also speaks to the cost of such conviction. Joan's faith led her to glory, yes, to victories at Orléans and Patay, to the coronation at Reims, to eternal fame. But it also led her to a stake in Rouen, to chains and accusations, to being burned alive at 19 years old. Faith does not guarantee comfort or safety. Sometimes faith demands everything. The most poignant aspect of Joan's legacy may be her abandonment by those she saved. Charles VII, whom she crowned, did not ransom her. The soldiers she led did not storm her prison. The church she loved condemned her. The France she saved watched her burn. Only after her death, only after victory was secure, did her nation and her church acknowledge what she had been. A light in terrible darkness. A voice crying out for justice and freedom. A girl who refused to accept that defeat was inevitable. Her words during her trial have echoed across centuries. I am not afraid. I was born to do this. They are words spoken by someone who has found their purpose and refuses to be turned from it, regardless of cost. They are words of terrible certainty and terrible courage. Every generation needs such voices. Every age produces those who hear a call to something greater than themselves, who see injustice and refuse to accept it, who recognize that the way things are is not the way things must be. Joan was one such voice. She was not the first. She was not the last, but she remains one of the most remarkable. The girl from Domrémy, who should have lived an unremarkable life tending fields and raising children, instead became a saint and a symbol. The voices she heard, whether divine or internal or some mystery beyond our categories, drove her to attempt the impossible, and she succeeded, and then she paid the price, and then she died, and then she lived forever. From ashes, resurrection. From defeat, victory. From silence, a story that will not end. Chapter 13. Closing. The voice that will not fade. Return with me to that marketplace in Rouen. The flames are rising. The girl is calling out to Jesus. Her voice grows weak, choked by smoke, but she will not stop praying. The crowd watches in horror and satisfaction and grief. The executioner will weep later, convinced he has burned a saint. The ashes will be thrown into the river to erase her from history. But you cannot burn truth. You cannot drown faith in a river. You cannot silence a voice that speaks for something greater than itself. What happened in that marketplace was meant to be an ending. The English thought they were eliminating a threat. The ecclesiastical court thought they were condemning heresy, but they were wrong. They were not writing an ending. They were beginning a legend that would outlive empires. 600 years later, we still tell Joan's story. We still marvel at the peasant girl who heard voices and obeyed them. We still ask ourselves what drove her, what she believed, whether we could ever have such courage. Her story has been told in countless books, films, plays, paintings. She has been claimed by nations and movements and churches. She has become a saint, a symbol, an inspiration. But beneath all the legend and symbolism, there was a real girl. She spun wool. She prayed in a village church. She heard voices that told her to do the impossible, and she tried, and she succeeded, and she died, and she won. Joan of Arc proved that history can turn on the faith of one person, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they believe deeply enough in something larger than themselves. Her story asks us hard questions. What would we do if we heard a call to something impossible? Would we have the courage to leave safety and comfort behind? Would we risk everything for a cause we believed in? Would we stand by our convictions even when standing means burning? Most of us will never face such stark choices. Most of us will never lead armies or change the course of history, but all of us face smaller versions of Joan's dilemma. Moments when we must choose between the safe path and the right path, between comfortable silence and uncomfortable truth, between accepting the world as it is and fighting to make it what it should be. Joan chose. Again and again she chose the harder road, and her choices saved a nation. The flames in Rouen burned for hours until there was nothing left but ash, but the light Joan kindled still burns. Every time someone stands against injustice, every time someone refuses to accept defeat, every time someone hears a call to something greater and answers it, that is Joan's legacy continuing. She was the Maid of Orléans. She was Saint Joan of Arc. She was Jeanne la Pucelle. But before she was any of those things, she was a girl who believed that one person could matter, that faith could move mountains, that darkness could be defeated by a single light. She was right. If this story moved you, honor it, not with worship of a distant saint, but with the courage to hear your own voices, the call to justice, to compassion, to standing firm when everything says to kneel. Honor Joan by remembering that legends are made not by superheroes, but by ordinary people who refuse to accept that ordinary is all they can be. Like this story, subscribe to our channel and carry the flame forward, because the world still needs voices like Joan's. It still needs people willing to attempt the impossible. It still needs those who believe that faith and courage can change everything. The story of Joan of Arc is not just history. It is a challenge. It is a reminder that the extraordinary is possible. It is a voice carried across 6 centuries, saying the same thing it said to a girl in a garden in Domrémy. Go. Do not be afraid. You were born for this. The next legend is already waiting to be written. Perhaps it will be yours.